and it's important that something is done about this relatively quickly.
My Lords, we will now move on to next business. Motion for debate, the Windrush scandal and the Windrush Compensation Scheme. Baroness Benjamin.
My Lords, lives have been ruined. People falsely accused of lying and breaking the law. Many have faced mental health issues and some have died without compensation. No, my Lords, I'm not referring to the post office scandal, but something equally shocking and unjust. The Windrush scandal, which I prefer to call the Home Office scandal, because that's what it is, their scandal. My Lords, I have stood in this House on a number of occasions over the past years, highlighting and drawing attention to this disgraceful state of affairs, and I am frustrated to bring this debate before the House once again and to demonstrate that the matter is still as distressing as ever for the thousands of victims. My Lords, as we approach the 6th anniversary since the scandal emerged and the 5th anniversary of the launch of the government's Windrush Compensation Scheme, it is with great sadness and extremely unfortunate that we are still talking about the scandal today and not focusing on the extraordinary contribution the Windrush generation has given to our nation. My Lords, the Windrush generation should not be defined by the scandal, but by the enormous contribution they have made to Britain, starting back in 1948, when they were invited to come and help rebuild Britain after the war, many leaving their children and families behind. I am part of that generation, and it was with great pride I chaired the Windrush Commemoration Committee to oversee the creation of the magnificent award-winning National Windrush Monument designed by Basil Watson, which proudly stands at Waterloo Station to celebrate this important part of our British history. It has become a symbolic place of pilgrimage for adults who recall their trauma, and they weep. Many children who are studying Windrush visit the monument, which is so uplifting. But sadly, my Lords, the shadow of the scandal hangs over us, as it remains clear that the injustices suffered by the Windrush generation still needs to be addressed in a more urgent and timely manner than is currently the case, because victims are suffering from trauma and serious ill health, both physical and mentally. My Lords, the number of people affected by the scandal is likely to be much higher than estimated by the Home Office. Figures vary dramatically and can be confusing, but as far as I can gather from lawyers, out of the potential 7,500 Windrush claimants, that's those who've obtained status documents and have suffered detriment, only 2,097 have received compensation. That's £75.9 million out of the £500 million put aside. My Lords, the Home Office scandal caused by the hostile environment policy resulted into untold harm to the hard-working people of the Windrush generation. These citizens lost their homes and became homeless on the streets or accommodated by friends or family in overcrowded properties, lost access to their bank accounts, had to borrow and to beg for money to survive, lost their driving licence and their pensions. They suffered humiliation of having to borrow or take handouts from their adult children. They couldn't access benefit. They couldn't access the NHS, so their health suffered and many died as a consequence of the lack of timely medical treatment. Their children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren also had their British citizenship denied. Many young people's higher education stopped as they couldn't establish their citizenship. Many were unlawfully detained in detention centres, causing them humiliation, shock and embarrassment and mental anguish that in turn affected their physical and mental health. Many were unlawfully deported, as admitted by the government. Some were taken to countries they didn't know and had to live on the streets without family support. Many died without receiving compensation. My Lords, this is a human story full of injustice and emotional trauma. My Lords, the survivors of the scandal feel let down, unheard, and their situations misunderstood. They are not illegal immigrants, refugees or asylum seekers. They are British citizens who entered the UK lawfully to study or work. My Lords, after years of work and dedication to Britain, it has been pointed out by Age UK that one of the many hidden consequences because of the result of losing employment and entitlements to benefit due to the scandal, many drew their private pensions early in order to make ends meet. This has led to a reduced private pension pot. In some cases, a loss of employment may have led to the loss of a private pension. However, loss of private pensions is not currently included in the scheme's calculation of loss of earnings. This is despite repeated calls from campaigners for the inclusion of private pensions. My Lords, whilst being locked out of employment, claimants have also missed out on their workplace pensions, which they have accumulated over the many years. This is particularly important because the majority of the Windrush victims are either of or are approaching pensionable age. Estimating these losses is complex, but as they are a direct result of action taken by the Home Office, Age UK believes the government should find a way to cover them in the compensation scheme. So, can I ask the Minister if the government will consider including loss of future earnings which is not currently compensated for under the scheme? My Lords, one of Britain's largest union, Unison, has told me their fears were realised as reports came in about compensation claims being delayed. Longer than a year of complex forms of small payments and high levels of proof. The compensation scheme has placed victims under scrutiny, treating their claims with suspicion and placed their applications and lives in limbo. My Lords, this has to end. My Lords, thankfully, there are a number of lawyers and individuals like Patrick Vernon who has got organisations to join together to set up the Windrush Justice Clinic to support and assist Windrush victims. They have all told me victims are nervous in coming forward, for they know the same people responsible for deporting them are also dealing with the compensation scheme. Absolutely. And believe this scheme should be overseen by an independent body. I have received dozens of case studies to justify this. My Lords, the government needs to understand that victims are coming from a starting point of having their core beliefs destroyed by this scandal. They have little or no trust in authority, which means that lawyers assisting them must first get over the hurdle of persuading them to trust and believe that they and others are there to help. Others, like Glenda Caesar, who came to the UK as a baby, lost her job as an NHS administrator in 2009 and faced deportation and was denied the right to work for nearly a decade. She now represents other Windrush victims and their claims for compensation. My Lords, just last week, someone working here on the parliamentary estate contacted me about problems they're having with a Windrush compensation claim, and I connected them with Glenda and other agencies. My Lords, Windrush victims need support to those affected by the Post Office scandal. The Windrush generation victims need support the Windrush generation victim needs similar support to those by the Post Office scandal. Yeah. The former government advisor to the Windrush Compensation Scheme, Martin Ford, KC, who has since become one of the fiercest critics, said that the process of the Windrush victims to claim compensation is still very document-heavy. It moves very slowly, and the Windrush Compensation Scheme cries out for legal aid. My Lords, retired judges, senior parliamentarians and forensic accountants are all working on the postmaster scheme. So can I ask the Minister, why is the government not applying this kind of expertise to the Windrush Compensation Scheme? My Lords, anyone who has seen the form will see how complex it is, especially as many claimants are in their 60s and 70s and have no access to the internet. Even lawyers and solicitors say they're having problems with the 3 different types of forms. The primary application form, which is 44 pages long. The close family member application form, 24 pages long. The representative of a estate application form, 46 pages long, all with vast online support notes and the requirement of a large number of supporting historic documents. Lawyers have told me these forms are one of the biggest hurdles in getting people to apply. My Lords, the House of Commons Home Affairs Committee agreed and said the scheme should be transferred to an independent body. This is something I have called for from these benches back in 2019 and was told by the Minister it would take up to 2 years to implement. That was 5 years ago. My Lords, this scandal is not going away, as the Justice for Victims campaign led by Colin McFarlane has shown. It has wide support from all sectors of society across the country. Their online letter to the Prime Minister has also called for an independent body to be established. My Lords, no amount of compensation can ever erase the hurt and humiliation that the Windrush generation have suffered since their arrival in the motherland, when signs in the windows read, "No Irish, no dogs, no coloureds." I have witnessed those signs. My Lords, we have heard so much about righting the wrongs for the Windrush generation, that the government's good intentions must be matched by their good outcomes. The Wendy Williams compensation recommendations were accepted by the government with good intentions, only for 3 important ones in the report, including having a migrant commissioner to be rolled back on in the most disrespectful way, which I highlighted here in this House last year. My Lords, it was clear that the government must demonstrate their well-crafted words of intent with well-crafted actions and stop this further humiliation and undignified treatment to the Windrush generation. There is an automatic payment of between £10,000 and up to £100,000 for those British citizens who have been granted status documentation through the status scheme, as they have suffered a high level of impact on life. This should be decided in 6 weeks, said the government, but it has taken much, much longer. Why, I ask the Minister? My Lords, to make matters worse, it has emerged that children born in the UK after 1983 are now being rendered stateless. This highlights the need for a renewed approach in partnership working with national organisations that support those affected on a daily basis to ensure not just that wrongs are being addressed, but also to ensure that related issues faced by those caught up by the scandal is fully considered. It's now more important than ever, my Lords, to properly resolve this situation for the thousands of people affected with compassion, consideration and empathy as quickly as possible in view of their age and trauma. Once they have sorted out, their descendants' lives can also be sorted out. My Lords, we have had 5 Secretary of States dealing with the Home Office scandal, yet only one has taken the time to meet the Windrush victims, some of whom are sitting in the chamber here today. They are proud, hard-working people who've contributed to British society but have been humiliated in the most disrespectful way. So can I ask the Noble Lord the Minister if he will show empathy and take time to meet them personally after this debate? My Lords, For progress to be made, it is essential that trust and confidence in the relationship between the Home Office and the Windrush generation is restored. Sadly, we are far, far from this. The solution should be for an independent body to deal with this scandalous, heartbreaking, cruel and shameful episode of British history. Because, my lords, trauma lasts a lifetime.
The question is that this motion be agreed to.
My Lords, could I first congratulate the noble lady, Baroness Benjamin, on securing this important and timely debate. The noble Baroness has done so much to champion the cause of Windrush and to celebrate the contribution of this valued community to British society. The personal journey of the noble lady is faithfully documented in What Are You Doing Here?, a very good read, the noble lady's autobiography. My own involvement in Windrush was awakened as a result of a question I was down to answer from the noble lady Baroness Benjamin in your Lordship's house on the need for a dedicated National Windrush Day, the 22nd of June, the anniversary of the arrival at Tilbury of the Windrush so many years before, in 1948. I was convinced it was a privilege to work alongside the noble lady. The government was moved ultimately a dedicated Windrush Day, a dedicated national service of celebration, the first at Westminster Abbey, a celebration at Downing Street, hosted by the Prime Minister, Theresa May, and all of this with the vital three words, with a budget. Organised via the Department of Housing, Local Government and Communities, as it then was, and securing afterwards exhibitions, music, dancing, food, historical perspectives, celebration of the vital contributions, economic, cultural, social, sporting, that have been given by this valued community, giving an injection of diversity into national life. It was truly a great success. Celebrations at Tilbury, at Brixton, Manchester, Bristol, Leeds, Nottingham, throughout the country, and in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland too. I remember working along Paulette Simpson, Sonia Winifred and others, and The Voice magazine, all well and good. The noble Baroness, as has been mentioned, headed up a committee to provide a lasting national monument. I see it regularly as I arrive en route to your Lordship's house at Waterloo Station. Very fine indeed. Nobody could have done more than the noble Baroness, all this positivity and hope. But meanwhile, alas, and shamefully, the Windrush scandal was unfolding. Of course, the original Windrush settlers arrived in 1948, over 75 years ago. They were the first members of a generation who had been encouraged to move to the United Kingdom, to our country, to help rebuild a new, regenerated United Kingdom after the ravages of the Second World War. And help rebuild it they did too, with vital contributions to national services and national life. My Lords, fast forward to the 1971 Immigration Act. This Act gave Commonwealth citizens the right to live and work here in the United Kingdom. This was, after all, their country. People had built their lives here, and generations followed. Then in 2017 to 2018, it was revealed that many citizens who had lived here quite legally, totally legally, for generations, many of them from the Caribbean, were wrongly refused access to basic public services or charged for services which were theirs as of right, and in some cases people were detained and deported. My Lords, just ponder that for a while. People with every right to be here, our fellow countrymen and women. This was and is a matter of national shame. Our government, a British government, had no proper records, no appropriate paperwork, and seemingly in many instances had destroyed landing slips for boats which had recorded people's arrival dates many years before. This rightly caused horror and outrage at this injustice, the hardship inflicted. There was a need for drastic action. The scandal raised serious questions about the Home Office, as has been rightly stated, about race, about our country. It still does, my Lords. Theresa May apologised, some positive action did follow. Close to 16,000 people who hadn't got documentation received documentation. Some, and the accent is on some, compensation was paid, but not enough and not quickly enough in view of the massive losses inflicted. Meanwhile, in June 2018, a review was set up. Wendy Williams, then Her Majesty's, as it was, Inspector of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services, was appointed by the Home Office to conduct an independent review of the Windrush scandal, focusing on events from 2008 onwards. The review was published in 2022. It didn't pull its punches. Alongside this review, it's worth noting that a transformation unit had been set up in the Home Office to deal with the Windrush situation and to carry forward Windrush policy. A reform agenda which successive Home Secretaries, Sajid Javid, Priti Patel, and initially I stress, Suella Braverman, all pledged to follow. My first question to the Minister, who is certainly not personally to blame for the stuttering policy and the serious errors that have been made, is why this unit was disbanded. And I hope my noble friend will do better than suggest this is due to the significant progress we have seen, a suggestion that has been made previously. It frankly is not credible. That is what may be called, if I can borrow a couple of phrases from across the pond, baloney or hogwash, or worse. This brings me to the Wendy Williams review, and I would ask my noble friend how many of the 30 recommendations accepted by the government at the time in full have been implemented in full, and how many are yet to be completed. 3 key recommendations, as we have heard from the noble Baroness, were ditched by Suella Braverman, although previously accepted in full by the government. The ditching of these 3 key recommendations was bemoaned and labelled a mistake by Theresa May in her compelling review of what had happened in her book, Abuse of Power. These recommendations include, as the noble Baroness has said, an independent Migrants Commissioner, and also a review and strengthening of the role of the independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration, as well as the organisation of reconciliation events between members of the Windrush generation and officials and ministers. Can I ask my noble friend the Minister why the government went back on its acceptance of these key recommendations? Why? 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 Was this all down to the personality of the particular Home Secretary? If so, will the position be reviewed by the current Home Secretary and those recommendations restored? I do hope so. My Lords, let us be honest about the position we are in. A generation of people and their descendants, largely from the Caribbean, many have been treated abominably. There has been recognition of that by Theresa May, then Prime Minister, and some action, but not enough and not speedily enough. Rather than take our foot off the accelerator, as was done under Suella Braverman, and apply what appears to be a handbrake turn, we should press full steam ahead. Every time the Home Office feels inclined to veer to the complacent, to the smug, to the self-congratulatory, it needs to remind itself of the people who have died without compensation, without a penny piece of compensation. It needs to remind itself of the backlog of claims, of the complex forms that had to be filled in, above all of the outstanding compensation claims that exist, and of the searing, justified, burning sense of injustice rightly felt by a section of our own community, our very own countrymen and women.
My Lords, it's the 1950s. Ferdy, Bernie, Dennis and Lenny arrive in London from the West Indies full of optimism about their futures. That's the opening premise of the musical The Big Life, that's returned to the Theatre Royal Stratford East. Life turns out to be harder than they expected. I mention it because it's where Shakespeare's love labours lost meets the Windrush generation. It isn't just a great Scar musical, it's also a timely reminder of how much we owe each other, how much we have all benefited in different ways, as highlighted so strongly by the noble Baroness, Lady Benjamin. Another reminder is the welcome decision by the Mayor of London to choose Windrush as a designation of one of the untangled overground lines. Appropriately, the Windrush line goes through Brixton, although we will leave for another day the unfortunate fact that it doesn't stop there. And there's the Windrush sculpture in Waterloo Station, as has already been mentioned. The recognition of the role of Windrush generation in these different ways is, of course, welcome. But equally, what would be even more welcome is fulfilling the promise of compensation for the British citizens from the Commonwealth who were wrongfully deported and detained and denied their rights. A promise made is not the same as a promise delivered. Much more needs to be done to fully address the harm caused by past policies and neglect. So that is why I heartily welcome the debate today and thank the noble Baroness for her excellent and compelling speech. I also welcome the strong speech from the noble Lord Bourne of Aberystwyth, and I particularly welcome his mention. Many people have been involved in this campaign. I particularly welcome his reference to the work of Sonia Winifred. Now, I look forward to the government's response to this powerful arguments being presented, although I have to say at this stage without a lot of optimism. Now, the government's failures concerning the Windrush generation must be highlighted in 5 key areas. First, legal status and documentation. Changes in immigration law over the years did not account for these individuals, leaving them without easy access to the necessary paperwork to prove their right to live in the United Kingdom. Given the passage of time and the complexity of the issues involved, the burden of proof should be appropriate, which it clearly is not at the moment. Secondly, we have to account for the hostile environment policy that ruled for too long. Without documentation to prove their legal status, many were denied access to healthcare, housing, employment and benefits, and some were detained and even some deported. These harms were not one-offs. They echoed throughout their lives and down the generations. I would mention here in particular the case of the significant number of British citizens who were chronically sick and mentally ill, but were sent to Commonwealth countries in the Caribbean between 1958 and 1970. The policy was that each patient should have expressed a wish to return and only sent there where there would be benefit to the patient and where there are suitable arrangements in the receiving country. But in practice, it has to be asked whether vulnerable patients have the capacity to make such decisions, and it is far from clear that the receiving countries have the capacity to provide these people with adequate care. Third issue is the lack of government support and action. Now, although the government has acknowledged the injustices faced by the Windrush generation and has established the compensation scheme, as has already been explained clearly, the process has been too slow, too complex, and inadequate to address the losses and hardship experienced. A major problem is the lack of support for claimants. I understand from an excellent report in the latest edition of the Brixton Bugle, Southwark Law Centre are taking the government to the High Court for refusing legal aid to a claimant through the Windrush Compensation Scheme, and I wish them every success. Another concern in the report is the research from King's College Legal Clinic that the Windrush Compensation Scheme statistically has the lowest success rate and the highest refusal rate for applicants of comparable compensation schemes. Only 22% of the 1,641 people who have applied have received compensation, with 53% of initial applications being confused. We must ask how many of those is because of the sheer complexity of the process rather than the fact that they weren't entitled. I hope the Noble Lord the Minister will address these concerns in his response. One additional question I would ask the Minister is whether sufficient resources are being provided to the relevant High Commissions so that they can support claimants resident in those countries. Fourth aspect is that this is part and parcel of the racial discrimination that the Windrush generation have had to face as part of the border issue that all people from minority ethnic groups have faced within the UK's immigration system. The challenges continue to demonstrate systematic issues of racism and discrimination that need to be addressed, and I think the call for a dedicated unit is the only real answer to that problem. Then there's the impact on people's lives. The government's failures have had a profound impact on the lives of many members of the Windrush generation, affecting their mental health, their financial stability, and their sense of belonging to the United Kingdom. I would just highlight the mental toll on claimants and their families caused by the government's inadequate response. Even after the initial crisis, victims continue to face negative experiences because of these policies. The trauma experienced by the Windrush generation can be passed down to subsequent generations. Families must grapple with the emotional aftermath affecting the mental well-being of children and grandchildren. I very much hope that the Noble Lord the Minister will be able to give us some hope in his response that these issues will be addressed.
My Lords, I also want to pay tribute to my honourable and dear friend, Baroness Flewella Benjamin. She is right to say that this scandal shouldn't define the Windrush generation, but she is equally right to say that we must address it and we must effectively deal with it. As has been said by many, the treatment of the Windrush generation is one of the country's greatest contemporary scandals. 6 years ago, almost to the day, the nation began to wake to the reality of a hostile immigration environment that had been going on for decades. But only then, 6 years ago, was the trauma, heartache, and pain laid fully bare. Thanks in no small measure to the dogged determination of those such as Amelia Gentleman, Patrick Vernon, Lee Jasper, and many others. As a matter of fact, I joined Lee Jasper and other campaigners on a march on Westminster demanding justice back in 2019. It's worth reminding ourselves of how this scandal affected tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of innocent people's lives, some directly, many others indirectly. More than 160 individuals were deported or detained. For example, grandparents who lived here for more than half their lives were deported to countries that they hadn't visited since early childhood. Some went on holiday to visit families and were not allowed back in the country. Many were financially ruined, sacked, found themselves destitute, blacklisted from jobs. I hate that term. Unable to open bank accounts and denied life-saving medical treatment. These British citizens were demeaned and hounded by the state in which this most loyal of British generations called the mother country. My lords, think about this for just a second. Can you ever ask for a greater loyalty from a generation whose ancestors were enslaved, then colonized by the UK? But nevertheless, they fought in 2 world wars to ensure the freedom of that nation. Then, after the war, accepted the pleas of politicians such as Enoch Powell. The irony there, eh? Enoch Powell pleading for this generation to come and rebuild a post-war broken Britain. These remarkable citizens, with the purest of hearts, rightly or wrongly, referred to this nation as the mother country. It is this generation, my mother's cohort, who the King of England and much of the Commonwealth described as pioneers. He went on to say, as part of the 75th Windrush celebrations, history is thankful and finally beginning to accord a rightful place to those men and women of the Windrush generation. He went on to add, it is, I believe, crucially important that we should truly see and hear those pioneers who stepped off the Empire Windrush at Tilbury in June 1948, only a few months before I was born, and those who followed over the decades to recognize and celebrate immeasurable difference that they, their children, and their grandchildren have made to this country. For the record, the King held 2 wonderful events to celebrate the 75th celebrations. One at Buckingham Palace, I attended that and my honourable friend did too, and another at Windsor Castle. My lords, in sharp contrast, I'm not aware of any celebratory events that Number 10 held, or the Home Office for the 75th celebrations. I am, though, very much aware that this government and subsequent governments, sir, have treated this generation with utter contempt. I think around the week of the Windrush 75th celebrations, for example, the Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, not one for much empathy towards people of African descent, Muslims, and those crossing the Channel, did little or nothing beyond announcing the abandonment of 3 key Wendy Williams Windrush recommendations, and they're worth noting again. Recommendation 3, for the Home Office to run a programme of reconciliation events with members of the Windrush generation. Recommendation 9, introduce a Migrants Commissioner responsible for speaking up for migrants and those affected by the system directly or indirectly. Recommendation 10, review the remit of the role of the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration to include consideration of giving that body more powers with regard to publishing reports. So, my lords, since those 6 years, what has changed? What has been achieved? Well, according to Age Concern and the Immigration Law Practitioner Association, not enough. Simple facts. About 15,000 undocumented people have been given paperwork by the Home Office since the scandal, proving that they have had and always had the right to live here. Officials initially expected that a similar number might claim for compensation and anticipated paying out somewhere upwards of £200 million. Some progress, my lords, has been made. So far, the scheme has paid out £75 million to 2,000 claims. But the scheme remains slow, bafflingly complex, and demanding of sophisticated legal advice. Navigating this process is difficult for any legal advisors. So how can, my lords, someone stripped of their dignity, not working, even begin to navigate this complexity? My lords, the victims of Windrush scandal are not offered legal aid, and as such, this House should note and recognise with great shame that people are literally dying waiting for justice. To date, 53 individuals have died waiting. Has the government and the Home Office learned anything from this very brutal abuse of power scandal? One in which, by the way, that has been said, has similarities with the Post Office scandal. It appears not. According to the indomitable Amelia Gentleman, the Home Office team that was asked with transforming the department after Windrush scandal has been formally disbanded. 3 teams with the Directorate were working on post-Windrush issues. One on ethics, think about that for a second. Another on training and monitoring progress on reform and commitments. And a third on engagement, who were told, your work is over. My lords, after many years of deep suffering, how do we properly right this wrong to a generation that deserved better? Step 1, and urgently, take this away from the Home Office. It has proven either incapable and or unwilling to effectively deal with this. For me, it's a little bit like an unrepentant burglar being asked to give back the booty they've stolen from victims. It ain't happening. 2, give free legal aid and fast-track compensation with clear published targets. 3, lower the burden of proof for claims and compensate fully for losses and impact on life. 4, re-implement those teams that were engaged with the work on ethics. Might I suggest, my lords, that right across government too, a standing item with every prospective policy legislation should have this. 5, full implementation of Wendy Williams' review turbocharged team with a turbocharged team to deliver. Finally, my lords, I would like to see, my friends here would like to see a gathering of all those prime ministers still alive with us from the 1970s to come here collectively and sincerely apologise. They include John Major, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Theresa May, Boris Johnson, Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak. A collective, heartfelt apology for the damage caused before it's too late.
Yeah. My Lords, can I start by congratulating my noble friend Lady Benjamin, both for securing this debate, for the eloquent and passionate speech that she has made today, and for the brilliant monument installed at Waterloo Station last year, to which her tireless campaigning led. Although many people may not have heard about the Windrush scandal, they, like myself, may not know how it arose. The tale is worth the retelling because it sets the context of how the Windrush scandal was allowed to arise and how it went from bad to worse. My Lords, under the Immigration Act 1971, foreign nationals that were ordinarily resident in the UK were deemed to have settled status and given indefinite leave to remain. However, many people were not issued with any documentation confirming their status, and the Home Office didn't keep a full register confirming who was entitled to settle to this status. So the fault for what subsequently happened lies at least in part at the door of the Home Office. Then we had the hostile environment, which was initiated by Theresa May in 2012, with the intention of deterring illegal immigrants. But the Home Office started checking more widely. By late 2017, media coverage started to pay attention to individual cases of long-term residents facing hardship due to their difficulties in proving their lawful immigration status. Jobs, homes, healthcare, welfare benefits, as we've all heard, were lost. People were detained, removed from the UK, and denied re-entry to their homes following trips abroad. My Lords, I can only imagine what it must have felt like to be faced with billboards saying, "Go home or face arrest," and the psychological distress felt by people whose residence was suddenly called into question after so many years. Research by the University of London found that psychological distress suffered by the Windrush population rose markedly after the 2014 Immigration Act and the subsequent Windrush. One or two noble lords have struggled with this word, so please forgive me. Scandal came to light. This had a worse psychological effect than the effect of coronavirus on the general population. Some interim measures to redress the damage were introduced, and Theresa May apologised in words to the effects of, "But I didn't mean you." But it was too late. The hostile environment had spread and infected large parts of the white British psyche. We've heard in 2018 Wendy Williams beginning her review of lessons learned and made 30 recommendations which were accepted in full by Priti Patel, the then Home Secretary. The compensation scheme came in 2019, administered by the Home Office. It is shameful to note that by 2023, fewer than 2,000 claims had been settled, only 13% of the outstanding claims. Unison have commented that the Home Office administrators of the compensation scheme have placed victims under scrutiny, treated their claims with scepticism, and placed their lives in limbo. They say, to many of those affected, the compensation scheme feels like more of the same, rather than justice. My Lords, clearly the Home Office, aided and abetted by the hostile environment, were the source of the problem, and I can't see them being capable of delivering the solution anytime soon, given their record so far. It seems clear to me that administration of the compensation scheme, as has been called on by so many others, should be placed in other independent hands. Age UK and many others, including the Lib Dem group here, are calling for this. And I have to report that even when compensation has been offered, some offers were insultingly low, and arguably the most important element of all, loss of private pension, was not considered, consigned to the too difficult box. Many of these individuals are now pensioners themselves, with no opportunity to make up the lost pensions that they would have received. Since Priti Patel accepted the Wendy Williams recommendations in full, the next Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, reneged on 3. To have a migrant commissioner, to engage with migrants directly, to have a review of the remit and role of the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration, and to have reconciliation events with Windrush families. Commenting, Wendy Williams said that the Home Office must open itself up to greater external scrutiny and advised them it was vital to improve the accountability, effectiveness and legitimacy of the system. Unison is currently working with other parties to provide a legal challenge to this decision and have been given permission to go ahead to the High Court this spring. In September 2021, Wendy Williams reviewed progress and said that the Home Office were potentially poised to make changes that it needs. But given that this is 2023, in 2023 there were only 13% through the caseload, I wonder if she is anywhere close to being satisfied. So I would like to ask 4 questions of the Noble Minister. Will the Government ask Ms Williams to include a further independent review of progress as part of her current wider remit to look at the Home Office functioning more generally? 2. A Home Office source said that they were worried about that reneging on 3 of the recommendations previously committed to signals that they were rolling back from commitments publicly made about not repeating those mistakes. What evidence does the Minister have that this is not the case and that the hostile environment is a thing of the past? 3. Will the Government hand the management of the compensation scheme to an independent body? It would help to restore trust and confidence. But if the Noble Lord the Minister was considering responding by saying, well, this would prolong completing the job even further, perhaps he could consider that it could hardly be slower. And 4th, on pensions, would the Government consider creating a team of actuaries to work solely on pension claims? That way it wouldn't hold everything else up. Before I sit down, my Lords, I'd just like to refer to another bigger picture we might want to consider here. I wonder how many, if any, illegal immigrants actually gave up and went home, or were deterred from coming to the UK at all by the hostile environment. It certainly hasn't stopped people risking their lives in small boats in the Channel, as we saw only yesterday from the tragedy in the news. I think we can conclude that the Government's immigration strategy is a failure, except in one sense. It has succeeded in helping to stir up racism and racial intolerance in this country, fostered hatred against all immigrants and even people of second, third and further generations back. After all, the Home Office only responds to the tone that is set by the government of the day. Unfortunately, the government of the day has been the Conservative Party, which has been setting the hostile environment tone for far, far too long.
My Lords, it's quite hard to contribute to this debate following the contributions of the Noble Lord Baroness Benjamin, whose respect, I think, is the word that's required. Lord Bourne of Aberystwyth, Lord Davies, Woolley, Lord Woolley, the good friends, and indeed those of Baroness Burt of Solihull. My humble contribution is in honour of the people sitting there, because you are dignity incarnate. It isn't, I'm pretty certain that the Windrush generation will not be known as a result of this scandal. You will not be known as a result of this scandal. It will not be your legacy. But the Home Office will be known. The Home Office culture, its standards, its values, its purpose will be known as a result of this scandal. This is outrageous. And we all know it. Not just those sitting in this chamber. Those outside this chamber know it as well. We all knew it when those lorries were driving around London talking about a hostile environment. We all knew that it didn't just mean illegal migrants. On my journeys through London, the looks I received, the comments, it was permission. It was permission. It was the lowering of the standards of tolerance and grace and acceptance and dignity that this country is known for throughout the world. And it was underlined by the Windrush scandal. The Home Office culture is simply not fit for purpose if it cannot protect all citizens of this country equally. If it cannot administer for all citizens of this country equally. It should be of deep concern to this House that British citizens were abandoned by the Home Office, which as taxpayers they have actually contributed to paying for. The apology was woefully inadequate then, and frankly it's woefully inadequate now. And the compensation process can only be described as cruel. It's almost designed to avoid the recognition of the trauma and continued trauma of the loss of income, pensions, already mentioned by the noble Baroness Benjamin. Why has it taken so long for this outrage to be resolved in favour of British citizens who have been so badly treated, so badly wronged? One has to wonder why. Why these victims of injustice have had to wait so long. It is true, Age UK should be thanked for maintaining the spotlight on this outrage, but we should also pay tribute to my good friend Patrick Vernon, to Amelia Gentleman, to Colin McFarlane, whose film must be required watching and listening to anyone who takes their role as a serious legislator in this country. Their tireless campaigning has kept this disgrace on the books. But in the context of the Post Office scandal, where the pace was immediate, the response instant, the Windrush scandal is glacial by comparison. What are we waiting for? What is the Home Office waiting? What is the government waiting for? I have to tell you, as the son of a nurse and the chair of the NHS Confederation, I note that many of the victims of this scandal have given loyal service to the NHS for many, many years. The reason why the Windrush scandal is so important and goes beyond the incalculable pain and anguish of the victims is that it sends a signal, not just to the Windrush generation, but to all those people who look like them, speak like them, admire them, are younger than them, people in this country who live with the Windrush generation. It sends a signal about how much we care. The fact that 5 Home Secretaries, given the responsibility of resolving this matter, didn't even meet with them. What greater signal could that send? We all know that what the chief exec does, what the chair does, sends a signal throughout the organisation. This is the Home Secretary we're talking about. Unacceptable, incompetent, uncaring. Saying sorry just isn't enough. Seeing this outrage as urgent is the Home Office's primary duty, a duty that it has lacked, that it has ignored to date. Baroness Burt commented on the "we don't mean you." I'm sorry, you do. You mean me. You mean my family. You mean all those people who care. In support of Lord Woolley's excellent recommendations, I would say that it's critical that a specialist unit be set up to expedite the Windrush claimants now. There is no excuse for the Home Office to continue the abuse of these good people. A second apology is not only due to the victims of the Windrush Home Office scandal, but to the Windrush generation as a whole. I do not want to see parties. I want to see apologies. It is a generational scandal. The noble Lord Bourne asked the pertinent question, which is why? Why under Suella Braverman was an anchor placed on the progress and procedures that have been put in place to reverse this outrage? I'd like an answer. We need to send a different signal, not just to the Windrush generation, but to the country as a whole. And that signal needs to be a message of gratitude, dignity, and apologies, yes, to that generation who helped build the NHS, fought in 2 world wars, often going unrecognised, and have built, with many others, this great country.
My Lords, I am very grateful to the noble Lady Baroness Benjamin for securing the opportunity to debate this very important topic. I thank the noble Lord for his speech just now. It is an honour to follow him, and with him I wish to acknowledge and honour those sitting in the chamber today. I am personally indebted to my noble friend Baroness Benjamin for being an inspiring role model. Being one of her play school babies, I was born in 1973, I grew up with the noble lady's visibility firmly in my view, but as a child and even as a young adult, no knowledge of her story or indeed of the narrative of the Windrush generation and the scandal associated with it. She has had an indelible impact on my life, and being in her company in this house is a tremendous honour. In the other place yesterday, a question was asked about another matter of delay, the infected blood scandal compensation. This and other areas of concern, Grenfell, Post Office, mean that we have a tapestry of issues with recurring themes of redress, compensation and delay. Yet these are not just issues, my lords, they are about lives and they are about justice. And I must note the disparity in processes that the noble lord has just mentioned. I'm only too aware that the Church of England is rightly getting its own house in order, albeit not fast enough. The noble Lord Boateng is working tirelessly in his role as chair of the Archbishop's Commission on Racial Justice. In her closing speech in a debate at the Church of England's recent General Synod, the Bishop of Dover reflected that representation at all levels of the Church is not yet where it should be. In 2020, the members of General Synod voted unanimously to apologise for the Church's racism and to give thanks for the contribution of the Windrush generation and their descendants to British life and culture. My lords, in my own context, in North East England, the city of Newcastle is passionate about its sport, particularly football. It is well documented that children of the Windrush generation changed football in Britain forever. They confronted discrimination not just on the pitch, but as the anti-racism charity Kick It Out reports, these players have had to cope with the additional pressure of beating racists on the terraces, in the media and in the boardroom. In 1996, the former Newcastle and Trinidad and Tobago goalkeeper, Shaka Hislop, from his own experience of racist abuse, helped found the charity Show Racism the Red Card. From its northeast origins, this charity now works tirelessly across the UK and also plays a vital role in tackling racism within professional and grassroots football. So, my lords, with this sporting context in mind, this issue is not a siloed one. It is about all of life, recreational, cultural, and it is most especially about the lives of those who still wait for recognition and compensation. And that is why we are here today, shamefully. In my own life and work, calls for justice and reconciliation are deeply ingrained throughout the biblical narrative. Other faith traditions, too, speak into these themes. My lords, I find it deeply distressing, as other noble lords have pointed out, that people have died waiting for their Windrush compensation claims to be processed. The noble lord, Lord Woolley, told us 53, my lords. In 2023, there were more than 2,000 claims where victims received a zero payment, more than double over the same period in 2022. My lords, it is not hard to see or understand the impact of delays, and it is not surprising that claimants feel distrust and suspicion of the Home Office. Claimants feel that they are being re-traumatised. They are being re-traumatised, asked for documents and proof in the same way that they were asked to try and prove their residency in the first place. This scheme is meant to be designed to compensate for the failings of the Home Office in the Windrush scandal and to provide justice for those people. And yet it seems the tenor of many claimants' interactions with the Home Office do not reflect this. A new report by University College London has found that government policies had a worse effect on the mental health of Black Caribbean people than the pandemic lockdowns had on the wider population, as the noble lady Baroness Burt mentioned in her speech. My lords, this increase of psychological distress deepens the trauma and injustice. Calls from victims, members of this House and the other place, and many campaign groups to address all of these matters is ongoing, seeking to ensure also that legal aid is guaranteed to all eligible claimants, because this is a huge barrier, as the noble Lady Benjamin has already said. I also ask the noble Lord, the Minister, whether the government will indeed provide this, or at least a system to recover legal costs, as the noble Lord Woolley also indicated in his excellent speech. In the progress report on the Lessons Learned review, already referred to in many speeches and in follow-ups, Wendy Williams said the review of the complaint environment policies remains essential to ensuring the Home Office learns from past experience and adopts a more compassionate approach. This was raised again in this House by the noble Baroness Lister of Bertisset in November of last year. Can I ask the noble Lord, the Minister, once again, what has happened to this review? My lords, we must surely rebuild the trust of the public in our government. I fear there is a risk that the compensation scheme that is meant to redress injustice is becoming part of the problem and a source of injustice itself. My lords, in conclusion, I am again grateful to the noble lady for bringing this debate today, and I commit to following her tireless work in this matter and to offering what support I can in my role.
My lords, I feel there's very little that I can say that will deepen the feelings that we've had expressed or mitigate the experiences that have been described to us or strengthen the arguments that have been put forward by the noble lords who have spoken before me. I don't want simply to offer a gesture of support. I can only undertake in my daily life to put into practice the high ideals they set and to live by the tenets of justice to which they have appealed. And in that respect, therefore, I don't expect to have much of substance to say in this debate, but didn't want to miss the chance to say even that. I have to say that the Noble Lord Adivale and my friend Lord Woolley, and in a moment Lord Hastings, by anticipation, are people who've kept us on our toes. But I want to say a word of respect also for one other contributor to this debate, and it's Noble Lord Bourne across the chamber. It takes a bit of guts when you're in the government and from the government benches to speak as openly and as frankly as he has. Yesterday, he was in an audience to which I spoke, and he said nice things to me afterwards. And I'm so delighted to have the chance to return the compliment today. In thinking about this debate, I was on two tracks as to any contribution I might make. The first was to take the report of Wendy Williams and make it the basis for our debate, but I would only want to do that if we went one at a time through the 30 recommendations she makes, to see what progress has been made in respect of each one of them. I know that we pause at the recommendation number 3, and the recommendation number 9, and the recommendation number 10, possibly have rather longer debates there. But I'd rather like to see how we measure progress against all 30 of those recommendations. Granted that even 10 minutes wouldn't allow us to do that. I can only say in the time that's available to me now, what a contrast as a member of your Lordship's House it has been for me in this last 3 or 4 years as we've enacted 3 pieces of legislation relating to immigration: the Nationality and Borders Act, the Illegal Immigration Act, and soon the Rwanda Act, which, when they were before us, commanded energy and support from those benches. Where there's a will, there's a way, and the government was definitely showing it had a will and wanted, therefore, to push matters through with energy and as quickly as possible. Contrast that with the length of time it's taken to deal with these proposals. Wouldn't the government feel it was a good thing to be able to say to the House, there, here are the proposals, they might well be in line with the Noble Lord Woolley's. Here are the proposals, they will be enacted within the next year, and the same energy be put into those other migration-related pieces of legislation we'll put into getting this sorted once and for all. Wouldn't that be simply wonderful? But look at the well-peopled government benches and ask yourselves whether that will can possibly be mustered in respect of this particular matter before us today. In the debates again and again and again that surrounded the 3 acts of Parliament I mentioned, we were told that it was important to stop the boats because the people of Britain wanted it. I don't know on what basis those who said those words really understood what they were saying, but I know that if we can get this thing done, wrapped up and dealt with quickly, I know that it'll be what the people of Britain want. And on that note, I'm very happy with 4 minutes of credit to everybody concerned to take my place again.
My Lords, it's a great pleasure to follow the Noble Lord Griffiths of Buryport, and I think the point that the Noble Lord made about the comparison of the cascade of immigration legislation we've seen and how that's been pushed past us and what's happened with the Windrush scheme is very telling. I want to thank the Noble Lady Baroness Benjamin for both securing this debate for us and join her in regretting that she's had to, and so for so powerfully introducing the debate for us. Now, it is really an honour to take part in this debate of the absolute highest quality. So it seems unfair to single people out, but, you know, everyone says that before they do it anyway. And I'm going to particularly single out the Noble Lord Woolley speech for so powerfully setting the scene of the enormous contributions made. And I should warn the Noble Lord that I plan to clip it and put it out on social media, so be warned. And I also want to join others in crediting the Noble Lord Warner Aberystwyth, who today carried the backbench flag from his own benches powerfully, all on his own. Now, I'm not going to apologise for briefly repeating some of the things that have been said before, because they are so important to see that they're driven home. And I think it's really telling. A number of people have referred to the Age UK report, which is actually out today. But the fact that it is Age UK that's producing this report is such a reminder that this is something there is huge urgency in dealing with, because people are dying before they receive both the compensation, which is important, but also the real acknowledgement that comes with that compensation, which I think is important to so many people. As Age UK has said, it must not be too late and more people go to their graves uncompensated for the enormous harm they and their families have experienced. Now, the figures we've heard, by the end of 2023, less than 2,000 individuals being offered compensation, often clearly inadequate, fewer than 1 in 7 that have been estimated to be eligible. So only 7,600 plus claims have been made, a little more than half what was thought to be needed. Now, what do we do? Others have said this, but I want to offer the Green Party support very strongly for the idea of an independent body to take this over. For all the reasons that have been outlined so many times by almost every speaker, the Home Office is inappropriate to be handling this, and they're not handling the situation. People are fearful to approach it. The hostile environment is what is associated with the Home Office, and the administrative delays and errors, the whole appeals process. It really is just not adequate. And I pick up the point made by the Noble Lady Baroness Benjamin and others that the scheme has to include compensation for the loss of private pensions and the loss of future earnings. And I also want to pick up the point of naming this scandal. As the Noble Lady Baroness Benjamin said, this should be called the Home Office scandal. Well, I'm afraid I'd turn that around and say the Home Office is a scandal, a long-running, enormous blot in the landscape of our governance. Now, the Green Party's position is that we need to split the Home Office in two, that it's impossible to be both the policer of immigration and also the body that's supposedly supposed to be welcoming people into the UK and facilitating their entry into the UK. But I think we also go wider than the scandal and the failure being the Home Office. Quite simply, our government is not working at the moment, and the Windrush scandal is a powerful demonstration of the fact that it's actually the most vulnerable, the poorest, who pay the highest price for government dysfunction. And that's something that's systemically true, not just true in this case, but powerfully illustrated by that. Now, I also want to again echo the Noble Lady Baroness Benjamin that no amount of compensation can make up for the suffering. But it is an acknowledgement, and that's crucial, and it's an acknowledgement not just to individuals, but it's also an acknowledgement about the continuing problems in our society. And a point that I don't think has been really highlighted, this can be a powerful step towards healing the problems of racism in our society if an independent body is created, if as fast as possible this situation is resolved and people get the compensation they deserve. And I think, just thinking about this, I've just been looking at some of the recent reflections on the issues of racism in our society. And Kalwant Bhopal, Professor of Education and Social Justice and the Director of the Centre for Research on Race and Education at the University of Birmingham, focusing on what's happening in our universities, saying that they're often taking tokenistic measures and failing to confront their complicity in racial injustice. The professor noted that there are only 100 black professors in the whole of the UK and only 4 minoritised community vice-chancellors. Curriculum remain underweighted on issues of slavery, colonialism, imperialism, and when people work on racism and social justice issues, it's too often considered as personal research, as something that's affecting them, not something that gets the proper professional weight. I also, reflecting on the racism today, there's a major study which has got very little attention, I'm afraid, from the universities of Manchester, St Andrews and King's College London, the Evidence for Equality National Survey, carried out by the Centre for the Dynamics of Ethnicity. And that reports that more than a third of people from minoritised communities in Britain have experienced some form of racist assault. The report really stresses that tackling racism is not just a case of removing bad apples from workplaces and institutions, but seriously transforming policies and procedures. Now, I think this has been a hugely powerful debate. I'm not going to take up my full 10 minutes because I want to keep the focus on the key points about Windrush. But I also want to finish with a final question. And if the Noble Lord the Minister can't answer this because I'm aware it's not within his departmental responsibilities, I hope he might be able to write to all of us, because it would be really important, I think, for all of us to know how much is being taught now in schools, primary schools and secondary schools, about the Windrush generation and about the injustice that they've suffered, because I think it's crucially important that future generations know what has happened, have an understanding of the processes of what has happened. And the point of that, of course, is to make sure we have change and we don't find yourself in your Lordship's house in 10 or 20 years confronting a new, similar kind of scandal.
Yeah. My Lords, all of us who have spoken so far in this debate have done so because of our profound respect and love for Baroness Benjamin, but also because the Windrush reality confronts us, and we feel angered and aggrieved at the obvious discriminatory outcome that the Home Office is facilitating. The facts speak for themselves. We've said them, we know it, and we understand it. If this was another ethnic group of people, it wouldn't be this way. Yeah. We encourage them to deny it. My father came here in 1952, came from Savlamar in Westmoreland in Jamaica. He came here to join the NHS. He came as a dentist. He brought my mother, who was a young nurse. My brother and I, the product of their adventure to Great Britain from Jamaica. When he and my mother came here, they told us stories of people's comments, misunderstandings. I remember so clearly my mother being asked, with me as a little 4-year-old boy at her side, "Before you came here, did you really live in trees?" A kind white lady in a northern town who didn't understand. We chose to take no offence at that, but it never left me, because it told me that people didn't understand what we had come to give over many decades. I don't get angered and aggrieved unnecessarily at what people say to me, but I feel fury for our friends who are here and the multitudes of those around the country, plus the families of those who've died, who feel they were scandalised and dismissed by a complacent department of government that arrogantly ignored their commands and demands and simply felt they weren't worth it, so they could be put to one side. We've said so much in this debate so far that doesn't need to be repeated. But I just wonder, when the Minister comes to reply, going back to the 3 points that were in Wendy Williams' report, which a previous Home Secretary thought good to ditch, if it was fine for South Africa to have a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, if it was fine for the much-adored Rwanda to go through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, if it was fine for Northern Ireland to go through a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, why is it not fine to have reconciliation for those who've been abused by careless,
public disregard deliberately undertaken by a department of government which is evidently failing. If the Home Office could be inspected by Ofsted or HMI, it would be in the red box. And we know that. So isn't it time, seriously, Minister, to hand over the Home Office payment system either to an independent department or maybe hand it over to the business department? Because when it comes to the Horizon Post Office issue, look at the pace, look at the energy, look at the impact, look at the speed. And also, if I may suggest, the government has seen fit to say, for everyone in the Post Office scandal, to set a £75,000 immediate payment and £600,000 for those who are criminalised. Why can't we do the same here? Instead of scrapping about whether it's £10,000 or £15,000 or £100,000, just blanket set it and pay it. And end this. Because if it's good enough for the post office masters, it's good enough for people who've served with their lives and many who've lost their futures as a consequence of this careless, arrogant, complacent, disregarding department. We're not asking anyone in the Home Office to justify what's gone on or to explain that it will be better, because we're already convinced that it won't be. We're asking this department, which has had so many Home Secretaries rushing to Rwanda and nobody else, to spend some time rushing towards those who've been victimised by its own careless, arrogant, complacent disregard. So, in conclusion, handing back many more minutes than previous members have done, let me just add this final point. Would it not be right for this government to go to the public in an election this year and say we fixed all these unfixed scandals, infected blood, the post office issues, the Windrush issues, and a multitude of others? We fix them because we're fixers who get things done, rather than with simply others who are going to hand it on to another government to have to scrap around. Get it done. Get it done.
My Lords, I too congratulate Lady Benjamin on securing this important debate on the Windrush scandal and the compensation scheme, and I will focus mainly later on the implementation and effectiveness of the compensation scheme. But first I want to note, as have other speakers, Lady Benjamin's own extraordinary contribution to challenging ministers and others about the Windrush scandal over many years. And the Right Reverend Prelate, Bishop of Newcastle, referred to being a play school baby. I had the privilege of working on play school with Lady Benjamin as a brand new trainee floor manager in the mid-70s. I have to tell you, that was a complete joy. Lady Benjamin, as others have said, and in fact she said herself, chaired the Windrush Memorial Committee. And I agree that the memorial is uplifting, moving. It is also a constant reminder to those of us in public eye that actually something was got wrong and it has still not yet been righted. Other speakers have spoken about how we've heard in other parts of our lives about the Windrush scandal. I'm sorry, I can't remember who it was. It may have been Lord Bourne referred to asked a question about children in schools. I'm pretty sure I've got the wrong noble lord. I apologise for that. Lady Benjamin's book, Coming to England, is the most beautiful story about a Windrush arrival. And it is in almost all the primary schools I've heard about. And I know that the children write to Lady Benjamin because she and I talk about it. My own grandchildren were really shocked by the racism that she faced as a 6-year-old. And I think our hope for the future is that actually, by the dramas, by the books, we will have a new generation who will not accept what has happened and continue to fight. But what has happened at the hands of officials and ministers is dreadful, my lords. And as Lady Benjamin said, the Windrush generation were not ever illegal migrants. So people being thrown out of their jobs, losing their homes, pensions, being imprisoned and deported over many years is now a real disgrace. Lord Davis of Brixton talked about plays, and in fact it may have been him I was referring to. We've now seen documentaries, dramas, screenplays and books. The Windrush generation have shouted from the rooftops. Are we listening properly yet? Lord Adubatiwale also rightly said that we do respect the Windrush generation. Our problem remains with specifically the Home Office and with governments and succeeding governments. The Windrush generation's perseverance and contribution to our country must be noted, and we need to be reminded. They've served large elements of our public services over the last 60, 70 years, the NHS, transport, but they are now key participants in every part of our working lives and our social and community lives. My Lords, I won't go into the detail because many other noble lords have talked about it, of what happened after 2017 when media coverage started to bring attention to individual cases. But the way the Home Office has reacted has not, either then or even now, held them in any sort of regard at all. There is one person I do want to mention, and that is former MP Norman Baker, who was the Home Office Immigration Minister in 2014, who resigned because he was not aware of those vans going round. He wasn't told before he actually saw them on the streets. And he felt that Theresa May in particular and the Conservatives government lurch to the right on immigration meant he could not continue to serve. My noble friend Lady Burt reminded us of when and how the press and wider society became aware of the treatment of the generation. And she also set out the timeline in some detail of the government apologies. My Lords, in 2018, Wendy Williams' report, when she started to take her review, focused on events from 2008, so well before the coalition government came into place. But absolutely at the heart of her findings was the fact that despite the government saying that it was taken by surprise by the scandal, she found that over the years officials and ministers repeatedly ignored the warnings. She said those in power forgot about them and their circumstances. And this was compounded by successive governments wanting to be tough on immigration, quote, by tightening immigration controls and passing laws which created the hostile environment, and which was done with complete disregard for the Windrush generation. As with other departments and scandals, there were also institutional blockages in the Home Office that has made everything much, much worse. Wendy Williams also said that while she was unable to make a definitive finding of institutional racism within the department, quote, I have serious concerns that these failings demonstrate an institutional ignorance and thoughtlessness towards the issue of race and the history of the Windrush generation within the department, which is consistent with some elements of the definition of institutional racism. As others have said, she made 30 recommendations, which she grouped under 3 headings: acknowledgement that the Home Office needed to acknowledge the wrong that had been done; transparency, the department must open itself up to greater scrutiny; and culture changes, where the department must change its culture to recognise that migration and wider Home Office policy was about people, and whatever its objective should be rooted in humanity. My Lords, many noble lords have talked about the 3 recommendations which the Home Office initially accepted and then rejected. 3 on the reconciliation, training and Home Office staff, which Lord Hastings referred to. It is appalling that that has gone. 9, the Commissioner, which other noble lords have referred to, and 10, the review of the remit of the ICIBI, ensuring that they work closely with the Migrants Commissioner. My Lords, these are at the heart of the cultural change of the Home Office. So can I ask the noble Lord the Minister if those 3 recommendations will be reinstated now that Suella Braverman is no longer Home Secretary? Wendy Williams identified a number of, in her review in 2022, but, my Lords, time is short and I won't say very much, other than she said that the Home Office was obscuring the full extent of her original findings, which has led to misunderstanding, incorrect implementation. So can I ask the noble Lord the Minister will she be asked back again a further 2 years on to complete that review that other noble lords have asked for to make sure that the implementation and that changing culture does happen? My Lords, turning to the compensation scheme, I have been speaking in your Lordship's House on both the Post Office Horizon and also the infected blood scheme. And there is a systemic problem in this country with numerous governments over many decades about how they are instituted. And I absolutely agree with the recommendation from Age UK that for this Windrush scheme, there is a separate independent scheme set up. But, my Lords, I think there is a much bigger ask, and I did raise this in the Horizon Post Office Compensation Scheme bill, which went through in one day last month, that we actually need a truly independent body to oversee all compensation schemes where any public service is involved. The one lesson we should have learnt over the last 50 years is that the government, its departments and its arm's-length bodies cannot be independent when trying to administer compensation scheme. So can I ask the Minister if that is likely to happen? The other points that have been made have also been covered in the other schemes, and despite people saying that the Post Office Horizon scheme is moving ahead swiftly, my Lords, the postmasters are getting derisory amounts offered to them. They are still competing with a simplified form that is utterly bemusing. They still don't get any money for legal advice to help apply. I think that is exactly true for Windrush scheme as well, and needs to be followed through. My Lords, as other noble lords have said, the problem with a badly working compensation scheme is that it re-victimises the victims. From these benches, we absolutely want to see the government put this scheme alongside the Horizon Post Office scheme and the infected blood scheme absolutely at the heart of working at pace, a phrase they frequently use. The Windrush generation has supported and helped us in our country, their country too, for many, many years. Why are they still being treated as different?
My Lords, I too thank the noble Lady Baroness Benjamin for putting down this debate on what she calls the Home Office scandal. I think the theme of this debate has been to extol the government to meet its commitments to the Windrush generation. In fact, I thank all noble lords who, through this debate, have kept up the pressure on the government to live up to its commitments. My Lords, I think I would go so far as saying this has been potentially an historic debate. It's been a strong debate which will resonate, and I hope it will resonate to make the government act faster. My Lords, my noble friend Lord Rosser put down a written question which was answered in February of this year, comparing the Windrush compensation rollout with the Horizon compensation rollout, which is a theme which had been picked up by a number of noble lords. And this was not to criticise the Horizon scheme, but to highlight the problem of those seeking compensation through the Windrush scheme. On the 7th of February 2024, my honourable friend Vicky Foxcroft asked Laura Farris, who's a minister in the Home Office, what discussions she had had with the Secretary of State on the time taken to process claims to the Windrush compensation scheme. Responding, Ms Farris stated that 91% of all claims had received a final decision or were less than 6 months old as of December 2023. She also stated that the scheme had reduced the time taken to allocate a casework decision from 18 months to less than 4 months. I'd be grateful if the noble Lord the Minister can confirm that those figures are accurate. Also, my noble friend Lord Davis of Brixton, in November of last year, asked the government what the reasons for the Home Office decisions were to disband the team responsible for the Windrush policy at the department, and what assessment they had made of the likelihood that the decision would undermine their commitments to the Windrush generation. The noble Lord Epsom, who's in his place, responded and said that given the significant progress that the Department had made since 2020, its response to the Lessons Learned review had been embedded into everyday activities. Now, the Noble Lord, Lord Bourne, described this as baloney, but it's not a word I would use myself. But nevertheless, he was sceptical, I think it's very fair to say, about the response from his noble friend, the Minister. The Minister said that the embedded approach would better sustain the improvements made so far and thereby our commitments to the Windrush generation and their descendants. Additionally, the Noble Lord noted that the teams working on the Windrush scheme and the compensation schemes would remain in place with there being no plans to close either scheme. So I look forward to the Noble Lord, the Minister, updating the House on how they are planning to work at pace, as we've heard that say, a phrase which we often hear in this House, to actually move to a resolution on more of these cases. My Lords, in July 2023, the House debated the 75th anniversary of the revival of the Windrush generation. The Noble Lady Baroness Benjamin led the debate, and in that debate she did acknowledge some progress had been made, but urged the government to redouble its efforts to ensure appropriate funds are distributed. My Lords, as Noble Lords will know, there is a long history to this scandal. Suffice it to say that on the 16th of April 2018, the then Home Secretary Amber Rudd apologised to the Windrush generation from the dispatch box in the other place, and the following day the Prime Minister, Theresa May, also apologised to Caribbean leaders at a meeting in Downing Street. The Home Secretary then went on to outline several actions the government was taking to address issues faced by the Windrush generation. These actions included, firstly, conducting reviews of historical Caribbean cases that the Home Office wrongly actioned or for either deportation or removal. Secondly, establishing a Windrush scheme to issue confirmation of status documents, and in some cases the granting of British citizen free of charge for applicants. Thirdly, creating a Windrush task force to assist individuals who may be eligible under the Windrush scheme. And lastly, establishing a Windrush compensation scheme. So, my Lords, how's all this going? I'd be grateful if the Noble Lord, the Minister, can correct any figures. There's been various figures quoted, but I've got some figures myself. In 2023, more than 2,000 victims received zero payment, despite the government accepting they are victims. The Noble Lady Baroness Benjamin raised the issue of a loss of future earnings, and that should be part of the calculation. If this was part of the calculation, would the government revisit those zero payment decisions on those 2,000 victims? And this is despite the government guaranteeing all those eligible would receive full compensation, and this was said in 2020. So my question to the Minister is there any flexibility in revisiting these cases, or does the government regard them as closed? Second question is, as of January 2024, 1,932 people have received compensation so far out of an estimated 15,700 victims. How long does the government think it will take to process the remaining claims? A further point is that the application process is still cumbersome and costly. It's a point which a number of Noble Lords have made. There was talk about the 44-page long document and other lengthy documents. And there has been expert evidence from accountants and psychologists which is needed to complete those forms. And there is a strong case for some form of legal aid to help people do that, and this is one of the organisations that's put forward is the Greater Manchester Immigration Aid Unit. And my noble friend Lord Davis gave figures for a very high refusal rate, and he also spoke about pension compensation. I wonder whether the Noble Lord can comment on the points raised by my noble friend. In addition to this, Human Rights Watch has recommended that in the interim, independent oversight of the scheme should be guaranteed with access to legal aid and the right of appeal to an independent tribunal. Does the government agree with this recommendation? And in fact, Human Rights Watch also recommended that the whole scheme should be independent and not run by the Home Office itself. Does the government agree with this recommendation? My Lords, comparisons have been made with the Horizon Compensation Scheme and the public consciousness of an historic injustice which is acknowledged by the British state. But I have no doubt that the noble lady Baroness Benjamin and other noble lords who've taken part in today's debate will continue to ensure that the government follows through on its commitments and that justice is done for the Windrush generation. My Lords, I wanted to comment on only a couple of many outstanding speeches. The noble Lord Hastings, said, let's be fixers, let's just get it done. And that noble lady Baroness Brinton also spoke about the other scandals which are being dealt with in the Victim and Prisoners Bill, the Horizon scandal, infected blood, Windrush, and there is an impatience in all of those scandals for the way the government is handling it. It is complicated, I do acknowledge it's complicated, but there really is a sense of urgency which the government needs to follow through on. And I also wanted to pay tribute to a particular journalist, Amelia Gentleman, who has done a lot of work exposing this scandal and really followed through on bringing it to the public attention. But I wanted to conclude on the point made by the noble lady Baroness Brinton about the new generation. I went to a London comprehensive school, and my children went to a London comprehensive school, and there is an absolute lack of understanding on part of my children and children generally who've been brought up in London on the extent of racism which was absolutely common in previous generations. So I see that as a sign of hope, and I think it is in part because of the ongoing work which is done by Baroness Benjamin and others. So while of course we're urging the government to do more, I think it is right that there is hope and of improving situation in racial tolerance in this country, and that I think we should celebrate.
Well, my lords, can I thank all noble lords who've spoken in this debate and, if I may say, made some very, very powerful speeches indeed. But I'd like to start by offering my thanks, considerable thanks, to the noble Baroness Lady Benjamin for securing this debate, of course, but also for more widely for the outstanding work that she has done on Windrush. Whether it be celebrating the enormous contribution the Windrush generation have made to our society, something we did last year for the 75th anniversary, or whether it is highlighting the injustice of the Windrush scandal, and the noble Baroness has been nothing short of a shining light on this issue. And for my point, I would like to personally salute the contribution of the Windrush generation and, of course, their descendants, and associate myself with the introductory remarks of the noble Lord Griffiths of Bury Port, who did earn much credit for those remarks. My lords, this is an issue of deep personal resonance for the noble lady Baroness Benjamin, of course, but it matters to all of us. As I thought, again, if I may say, that the noble Lord Woolley explained very powerfully. It's been clear from all of the other contributions as well, of course, and for that I'm thankful. And I also use Waterloo Station and commend, like my noble friend Lord Bourne, the memorial statue there. It presents a powerful and, I think, vital image. We all wish we could turn the clock back and prevent the pain and suffering the victims of the Windrush scandal have had to endure. Can I say gently to the noble Lord Woolley, numerous events across all departments were held last year. He will know that flags were flown. Number 10 held a reception which was hosted by the Levelling Up Secretary and the Home Secretary, and the largest ever Windrush Day grant scheme was launched. In terms of turning back the clock, however, we can't do that. But what we can do is strain every sinew to provide the people affected with the help that they need and the compensation they deserve, while also ensuring that the failings that happened previously can never be repeated. Because if I may say, the noble Lord Adibawali is right. The government does have a responsibility to all of our people. My lords, righting the wrongs is, and it has been, and will continue to be a priority for the government. I would say to the noble Lord Hastings, we are fixing things, and to the noble Lord Ponsonby, there is an urgency to do this and to get it right. We are determined to ensure that everyone who has suffered because they could not just demonstrate their lawful status in the UK receives every penny of the compensation to which they are entitled. There is no cap on the amount of compensation that can be awarded, and our priority is to award the maximum compensation at the earliest point possible. I repeat the promises made by successive Home Secretaries. There is no end date for the Windrush Compensation Scheme, nor for the Windrush Documentation Scheme. My Lords, references have been made to the 15,000 people and £200 million figure in compensation. But can I stress these are from the very early planning assumptions that were published when the compensation scheme was launched. There was not, or this did not represent a budget or a pot of money to be drawn from. Despite extensive and ongoing outreach efforts, significantly fewer claims have been received, and the Home Office has adjusted its planning assumptions accordingly. The Noble Lord Davis of Brixton asked about individuals and their documentation confirming their status and British citizenship. That number is now more than 16,800 who have been provided with that documentation. And the experience that we've had has shown that many of them have not suffered losses or detriment owing to being unable to demonstrate their lawful status in the UK, so they have not needed to claim for compensation. But the Home Office encourages anyone who wishes to make a claim to do so. As I have said, the scheme has no end date. There is no cap on the amount of money that the department will pay.
I thank Noble Lord for giving way. Is there any estimate of those who aren't entitled to compensation would be entitled if pensions and future earnings were part of the scheme?
My Lords, I will come back to the subject of compensation, and can I also just say I am going to attempt to address all of the questions that have been raised in the appropriate order, and there is a lot to say and I only have 20 minutes to say it. So with respect to interventions, if you could bear that in mind, I will do my very best. My Lords, we have paid over £75 million in compensation. As of December 2023, over 80% of claims had received a final decision, and the majority of live claims were less than 6 months old. Payments to date include some very significant sums. More than 120 claimants have been paid over £100,000 in compensation. Noble Lord Ponsonby asked me about 91%, a figure given by Laura Farris in the other place. 80% have had the final decision, as I've said. 91% have had a final decision or are outstanding and are less than 6 months old. So that number is in fact correct. The Noble Lady Baroness Benjamin and others have raised the question of speed. As I have said, the Home Office's priority is to award the maximum compensation at the earliest point possible. The changes the Home Office have made to the scheme since its launch mean that people do now receive significantly more money more quickly. I've referred to the 80% figure. However, in answer to the Noble Lord Hastings and his comments about blanket amounts, there are 14 different categories and each person's experiences and circumstances will be different. So it is right that the Home Office does take the time to ensure that each claim is considered and understood carefully so that they can offer people the maximum compensation to which they're entitled. But that said, the Home Office continues its efforts to reduce the time it takes to process claims. And my Lords, the length of time individuals must wait for their claim to be allocated to a substantive decision maker is now less than 4 months. This is down from around 18 months a year ago. And the 4-month period includes all the essential eligibility checks, together with a preliminary assessment to make an initial payment of £10,000 wherever possible. My Lords, the Department is committed to ensuring people receive the compensation they're entitled to in all cases, including those where understandably there is limited documentary evidence. The scheme operates entirely on the balance of probabilities, and decision makers receive in-depth training to ensure that this approach is applied fairly in consistency. Decision makers use all of the data and information available to them and exhaust internal and cross-government routes before asking for more information from individuals. The Home Office also gathers information from third parties, paying for this where needed so that costs do not fall to claimants. That can include from employers, from HMRC, from GPs, and so on and so forth. We have a quality assurance team and an independent review process in order to ensure that all decisions are subject to a very high degree of scrutiny. The compensation scheme was designed to be accessible to anyone without the need for legal advice or assistance. For those who want or need support to make a claim, the Home Office provides free assistance through its independent claims assistant provider, the We Are Group. They have extensive experience of dealing with isolated and vulnerable people, and the Windrush team is also available on the phone to provide information and discuss the process. In 2021 and 2022, the Home Office also published new claims forms developed in collaboration with stakeholders, which are simpler and easier to complete. Where applicants are allowed to recover legal costs in applying to the scheme, this may serve to encourage organisations to take advantage of applicants allowed potentially vulnerable people to charge them for unnecessary support. And my Lords, in terms of the feedback and the engagement with stakeholders in the community about the effectiveness of the scheme, as evidenced in the changes of the scheme since its inception, we have continued that process because the overhaul to the scheme in December 2020 significantly increased the amount of compensation awarded and indeed the speed at which it can be paid. In 2021 and 2022, we published revamped claim forms to which many noble lords have referred, and they were developed in consultation with stakeholders, and they are easier to complete. They are longer, but they are easier to complete because they include more targeted and closed questions. The new forms have a crystal mark from the Plain English campaign, and as I've said, the changes were made in consultation with stakeholders. My Lords, those stakeholders include the Windrush National Organisation, key advocates in the community. They work in collaborative. Considerable changes were made to the forms while they were being redesigned. But if anybody would care to still add in to the process and to make observations on the forms and so on, that the door is open. We're happy to listen to them. My Lords, in 2021, we launched a package of support to help those making or who have already made claims on behalf of a relative who has passed away to obtain the legal documentation required to process their claims. And in 2022, we broadened the homelessness category to allow awards to be made to people who were already homeless and then continue to be homeless due to an inability to demonstrate lawful status. We also introduced a fourth living costs category for close family member claims for costs incurred while supporting somebody who lost their employment or benefits because they were unable to prove their immigration status. Last year, we made changes to the employment category, which means some people will be compensated for longer periods and receive more money, better reflecting their unique circumstances. And whenever changes are made, they are applied retrospectively. My Lords, coming back to the points that were raised by the Honourable Lord Davis about why the scheme doesn't cover loss of employment opportunity, it's because this is a highly speculative issue and it stretches across many facets of an individual's life. So the scheme cannot make financial determinations of this nature, since they will vary significantly from individual to individual, and they depend on a multitude of factors which will be difficult and timely to assess in a fair and consistent manner. And as regard pensions, in answer to the Noble Lady Baroness Burt as well as the Noble Lord Davis, the scheme doesn't cover occupational pensions because of the variable and complex nature of the impacts on and future performance of those. But through the employment awards, individuals will recuperate the contributions they would have made into an occupational pension scheme at the time. And processes are also in place so that where individuals were unable to work because they couldn't demonstrate their lawful status in the UK, their national insurance record is corrected so that their state pension entitlement is not affected. My Lords, in terms of moving the Windrush Compensation Scheme from the Home Office, well, the Home Office firmly believes that moving the operation of the compensation scheme would risk significantly delaying vital payments to people. And this was reinforced by Professor Martin Livermore, who's the independent advisor to the scheme, in his report that was published in March of 2022. My Lords, we continue to work to promote new applications to the scheme and to engage with and gain the trust of affected communities. The scheme's engagement team ensures there is regular dialogue with stakeholders from Windrush communities who provide feedback and scrutiny. The compensation scheme engagement team supports events with external stakeholders from Windrush communities, as I say, to provide the opportunity to speak to them about the impact the scandal has had on them and on their families' lives. And these engagement events also ensure that individuals and stakeholders get the correct information about the schemes, the Windrush Documentation Scheme and the Windrush Compensation Scheme. So since February 2023, the Windrush Compensation Scheme engagement team has attended more than 30 events nationwide, which include the West Midlands, Bristol, Nottinghamshire, Yorkshire, Lancashire, Oxfordshire, Northamptonshire, Bedfordshire and London. This week, officials attended an event in Northampton, which received positive feedback, commending the informative presentations and the benefit of over 120 conversations with Home Office staff. And events are planned during the first quarter of this year, including in London, Edinburgh and Nottingham again. We're also looking at opportunities to work with communities in Wales and Ireland. These engagement events also ensure that individuals and stakeholders receive accurate information about both themes. And as I say, there have been a large number of these engagements that have taken place. My Lords, I think, noble Lords asked about scrutiny of the scheme and how the Home Office considers claims. As I've explained, we have a multi-layered review process to ensure the compensation scheme has an appropriate level of external scrutiny. And if I may, I'll go into those layers. So the Tier 1 review is conducted by a separate team that has not worked on the claim in question. The Tier 2 review is an independent review process with the Adjudicator's Office. The independent person, Martin Levermore, to whom I've already referred, regularly engages with officials and publishes annual reports on the scheme, and his third report was published on the 1st of November 2023 on gov.uk. The Home Office has published a fact sheet and granular transparency data on a monthly basis, which provides detail on a wide variety of aspects of both casework and review. The Home Affairs Select Committee provides external scrutiny and visited the department to scrutinise proceedings. And the Home Office have also hosted other stakeholders, such as the Windrush Defenders Legal and the Independent Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration, on open visits, giving access to Home Office caseworkers. And my Lords, on the subject of the Windrush programme and all the lessons being learned, the Home Office is absolutely determined to deliver its commitment to righting the wrongs of the Windrush, and that work does continue at pace, and I'm not ashamed to use the phrase. As you would expect and should expect in any government department, organisational structures change over time to ensure that delivery for the public is effective and is delivering value for money. It has been decided that responsibility for delivering various Windrush response projects and recommendations will no longer be managed through a dedicated team in the Transformation Directorate, but will instead be embedded in our everyday activities in other parts of the department. I forget who, but someone referred to it being as part of the departmental DNA. And I can confirm, albeit anecdotally from my experience, that is something that is considered with pretty much every aspect, every aspect of the work that we are currently doing. My Lords, most again, noble Lords, asked about the promises that were made as regards to recommendations 3, 9 and 10. Wendy Williams recognised the scale of the challenge that was set by her 2020 Windrush Lessons Learned report and applauded the department's response in rising to the challenge. As the former Home Secretary set out in her WMS of the 26th of January 2023, she did decide not to proceed with some of the recommendations in the original form. I'm afraid I'm unable to comment further because there are legal proceedings in train on that particular subject. But work, as I have just said, remains ongoing on the majority of the recommendations by way of embedding them into the DNA of the department. And that work will not stop.
I wonder if the noble Lord would give way on that point very briefly. I'm very interested in the ditching of those key recommendations, which most contributors felt was wrong. And I wonder if he could confirm, if whatever the nature of the legal proceedings, that the current Home Secretary will consider reinstating those, which are a vital part of the Windrush policy.
I'm going to have to apologise to my noble friend. I would like to answer the question in detail, but I'm unable to as a result of the legal proceedings. However, I will of course make sure that the Home Secretary is well aware of the noble Lord's concerns and indeed the House's concerns as regards this particular matter. My Lords, the noble Lord Davis asked about overseas engagement, and particularly with regards to High Commissions. We did engage with UK-based Caribbean High Commissioners, but we've also worked with British High Commissions overseas in order to raise awareness of this. And my Lords, the noble Lady Baroness Bennett of Manor Castle asked about education. which I think is an incredibly important point. On Windrush Day, the Department for Levelling Up launched a set of educational materials which were uploaded to the National Windrush Monument website as part of the Monument's legacy programmes. I have to confess I have not read the Noble Lady Baroness Benjamin's book. I will, but perhaps as book recommendations were being handed out, I should also commend one from my noble friend Lord Popat, which he wrote called A British Subject, which I would recommend as a very good read on this particular topic as well. I would also say to the Noble Lady Baroness Benjamin, I'm more than happy to meet at any time. And just to be fair to my predecessor, Lord Murray did attend two Windrush National Organisation conferences, so he did make himself available. My Lords, the Windrush story is one of the most powerful and uplifting in our country's history. The people who arrived on that day in the middle of the 20th century and their subsequent generations have contributed so much across so many areas of our society, as has been noted by all of the speakers. And that they would go on to suffer as they did is a source of profound sadness to them all, and us all, and shame. We owe it to them to put it right, and significant progress has been made, as I hope I've set out. But the job is not done, and noble lords have my assurance that the government's determination to righting those wrongs is indeed undimmed.
I thank the noble lord for his comments. My lords, I want to thank all noble lords who have taken part in this important debate for their kind remarks. We're friends all over the House, which is great, all sides of the House. That's what I try and do. And I want to thank them all for their passionate speeches. It's shown that everyone who has spoken across the House cares about fairness and justice above everything else. My lords, perhaps I should declare an interest as I am part of the Windrush generation, because I came to Britain aged 10 on my elder sister passport in 1960. Fortunately, when I was 17, my mother wisely decided to apply for passports for all her 6 children. Had she not done so, I could easily have become a Windrush victim. My lords, the Home Office didn't seem to have much difficulties in identifying people accused of being illegal and were prepared to deport them as quickly as possible, yet they don't practice the same ability to identify those people who are eligible for compensation at the same speed. My lords, I'm naturally disappointed with some of the answers the noble lord has given us, but not surprised, because the reality of the Windrush victims' experiences are not a happy one, or a positive one, as he might have pointed out. He doesn't agree with me and other people who have spoken across the noble lords who have spoken across the House that we do need an independent body. It's common sense solution to end this unfortunate scandal. Members have agreed with that, and we've agreed that for so many years now in this House, my lords. Lord Bourne, my noble friend, and I are allies. We've been allies over the years, and I thank him for his support and kind words. It's always a joy working with him, especially on the National Windrush Monument. Thank you, Lord Bourne. Lord Davis of Brixton reminds us of the contribution the Windrush generation has given to the country and mentioned the new Windrush line, which will forever be kept in the public's memory. Thanks to the Mayor of London. Thank you for mentioning that. I want to thank my noble friend Lord Woolley for his passionate and moving speech, and it reminds us that the King has shown empathy with the Windrush generation by commissioning those 10 portraits, which will be part of the Royal Collection, celebrating the 75th anniversary of the arrival of Windrush pioneers. The Prime Minister had held no such celebration, even though I wrote to him and begged him to meet the Windrush victims. My noble friend, Lady Bird, pointed out the low payments offered to claimants with no justification and asked why, like other peers, why the 3 Wendy Williams recommendations were dropped. I note what the noble minister has said, but we need to find out why this has happened. And we've also called once again for that independent body. My noble friend, Lord Adedewo, asked for an apology to the Windrush victims, but asked not just for an apology to Windrush victims, but all the Windrush generation and the majority of the people in this country who feel ashamed of the blot on the landscape of this British history saga. The Right Reverend Prelate and Bishop of Newcastle, my play school baby, spoke with passion and called for trust to be restored as the nation deserves it, because they feel ashamed of what has happened to these Windrush victims. I want to thank Lord Griffiths for reminding us that this is not a party political issue, but a national issue. Baroness Bennett, like others, agreed that there should be an independent body. You see, that's coming over time and time again. She also pointed out that racism still is present in our society. Even children are facing this injustice, the same way I had to 64 years ago when I arrived in this country. I want to thank the noble Lord Hastings, for who is an inspiration to me and a towering figure in the House. He has also suggested fixing the problem immediately before the election. What a joy that would be. So I won't have to call another debate if that happens. I want to thank my noble friend, Lady Brinton, my play school colleague, for she has continued supporting me on this issue and has pointed out that school children across the country reading my book Coming to England and don't want those children to grow up in a society where we are dealing with this scandal. They see it as unfair and unjust. They write and tell me this. They write and say, Floella, when I grow up, I will not be racist. I understand about Windrush. I want to be somebody as a decent human being in this country, embracing all people. That's what children are understanding. That's what we have to show them as examples. The noble Lord Ponsonby outlined the timeline the Home Office scandal, and is very focused which is very focused in showing the injustice of this human story. My Lords, I want to thank all the organisations and individuals who have assisted and contributed to this debate, including Action for Race Equality, Justice for Windrush, Windrush National Organisation, Windrush Justice Clinic, Age UK Unison, and many, many more, for all the lawyers who've advised me, for the dozens of Windrush victims who have shared their harrowing stories. My Lords, we have all come together to work in collaboration to bring this unhappy saga to a satisfactory conclusion. And we have reached out to the government and hope that they listen and act upon what has been said today. Because, my Lords, the fight for justice will continue. Once again, I thank all noble lords for taking part in this important debate. And yes, let it be the last time I am doing so.
The question is that this motion be agreed to. As many as are of that opinion will say content. The contrary not content. The contents have it. My Lords, we come now to the repeat of a statement made in the House of Commons today on the security of elected representatives. Lord Sharp of Epsom.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement on the security of elected representatives. This House brings together our nation. People from every part of our United Kingdom, every background, are represented here to